The evening air carried a calmness that made everything feel ordinary. The sky was dimming and the streetlights had just started to flicker on. A man named Daniel was driving home from work, tired but relaxed. He worked long hours at a small tech company downtown, and Fridays were usually his chance to take a deep breath before the weekend. His playlist was on low volume, the kind of old-school R&B that made him hum along without thinking. He wasn't speeding. He wasn't distracted. He was just trying to get home. As he turned down a quiet residential street, Daniel noticed flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. At first he thought they were meant for someone else. He glanced around, but there were no other cars nearby. A small knot formed in his stomach. He slowly pulled over to the curb just like everyone's told to do. He took a deep breath, put the car in park, and rested both hands on the steering wheel. He had seen too many stories on the news to take any chances. His phone was sitting on the passenger seat, screen lit. After a moment of hesitation, he opened the camera and hit record. The police car stopped a few feet behind him, its headlights flooding the inside of Daniel's car. In the mirror, he saw the door open. A tall officer stepped out, his figure outlined by the flashing lights. The man walked with purpose and not rushing but not calm either. His posture said everything before his words did. Daniel rolled down his window and waited. The officer stopped by the driver's side, flashlight in hand shining directly into Daniel's face. "Evening, officer," Daniel said quietly. "License and registration," the officer replied. His voice was firm, a little sharp. Daniel nodded. "Sure thing. Can I ask what this is about?" The officer tilted his head. "Broken taillight," Daniel frowned slightly. "That's strange. I just had the car serviced last week. Maybe it went out today." "License and registration," the officer repeated. Daniel moved slowly, keeping his hands visible. "My wallet's in my back pocket," he said, just to make sure there were no surprises. The officer didn't respond. He just watched. As Daniel handed over his license, he noticed the officer glance at the inside of his car, the laptop bag, the water bottle, the work badge hanging from the mirror. The man seemed to take everything in but said nothing. "Where you headed?" the officer asked. "Home, just got off work." "Where's home?" "About 10 minutes from here," Daniel said, keeping his tone polite. The officer nodded slowly, still studying him. "You live around here?" "Yes, a few blocks away," Daniel answered. "Is there a problem, officer?" Instead of replying, the officer stepped back and shined the flashlight across the rear of the car. Daniel could see him in the mirror, crouching slightly as he looked at the taillights. A few seconds later, the man came back, tapping the flashlight against his palm. "Step out of the car for me." Daniel blinked, caught off guard. "Sir?" "Step out of the vehicle." Daniel hesitated. "Did I do something wrong?" The officer's expression tightened. "Do I need to repeat myself?" Daniel's pulse quickened. He'd done everything right, pulled over, kept calm, followed directions, yet things were taking a turn he didn't understand. Slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out. The cool air hit him instantly. The street was empty, quiet except for the low hum of the police radio. The officer told him to stand by the car. Daniel complied, still trying to stay calm. "Do you have any weapons on you?" "No, sir. Mind if I check?" Daniel's heart skipped. "I'd prefer not to be searched, officer." "I haven't done anything wrong." The officer's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're refusing a lawful request?" "I'm just saying I don't consent to a search." The silence that followed was heavy. The officer leaned closer, his tone low but cold. "You people always think you know the law, huh?" Daniel felt his chest tighten. He looked at the badge, then at the body camera blinking red. "I know my rights, officer." "That's all?" The man smirked, shook his head, and walked around the car again. Minutes passed like hours. Finally, the officer returned to his cruiser. Daniel stood there, his hands at his sides, trying to stay composed. A second police car arrived, its lights bouncing off the nearby houses. Another officer stepped out, younger, quieter, and clearly following the lead of the first. The first officer spoke briefly with his colleague, pointing at Daniel's car and waving his arms in short, impatient gestures. From where Daniel stood, he couldn't hear much, but the tone said enough. After a few more minutes, the lead officer returned. "Turn around," he ordered. "Sir, what for?" "You're being detained for obstruction." Daniel's jaw dropped. "Obstruction of what?" "You refused to follow instructions." "I did everything you said," Daniel replied, his voice rising slightly. The officer grabbed his wrist, twisting it just enough to make Daniel wince. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Daniel didn't resist. He felt the cold metal of the cuffs snap around his wrists. The younger officer looked uneasy, glancing between them, but said nothing. "This is a mistake," Daniel said quietly. "Tell it to the judge," the officer muttered. As they walked him to the patrol car, Daniel's phone was still recording, sitting on the passenger seat of his car. It caught everything: the stop, the search, the arrest. At the station, Daniel was processed like anyone else. Fingerprints, photos, personal belongings in a small plastic tray. The fluorescent lights made everything look harsher than it was. The officer filled out his report without even looking at Daniel, typing quickly, almost rehearsed. When Daniel finally sat in a small holding cell, the adrenaline started to wear off. The anger came next. He had been respectful, calm, and careful, yet somehow, he was sitting in a cell accused of resisting arrest and obstruction. He went over the events in his mind again and again, searching for a single moment he might have done something wrong. There was nothing. Hours later, an officer opened the door and handed him paperwork. "You'll be released soon. Court date's printed there." Daniel looked down at the sheet. The charges were listed clearly: resisting arrest, obstruction of justice. He laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. When he got home early that morning, he plugged in his phone and replayed the video. Every detail was there: the stop, the flashlight, the officer's tone, the unnecessary handcuffs. It was all evidence. But as he watched, a thought crossed his mind. Would anyone believe him? The next few days were heavy. Daniel told his sister, who immediately wanted to post the video online. He said no, not yet. He wanted to handle it the right way. He took time off work and began reading. Every night after dinner, he sat at his kitchen table surrounded by papers, notes, and his laptop. He researched traffic laws, arrest procedures, and civil rights protections. The more he read, the more he realized how many small rules the officer had broken that night. He wasn't a lawyer, but he was smart, detail-oriented, patient, and disciplined. When the court summons came, he decided to represent himself. Friends told him to hire an attorney, but he couldn't afford one easily, and besides, he wanted to face the officer directly, not out of revenge, but because he believed that truth had power when you knew how to use it. The weeks passed slowly. The memory of that night still haunted him. The helplessness, the cold tone, the way he'd been treated like a threat when he'd done nothing wrong. But that same memory pushed him forward. He requested copies of the police report, the officer's body camera footage, and dispatch records. It took effort and persistence, but he got them. When he read the report, his jaw tightened. It was full of false details, claims that he had refused to show ID, that he had raised his voice aggressively, and that he had attempted to leave the scene. None of that had happened. The video proved it. Daniel sat there in silence, holding the report in one hand and his phone in the other. He couldn't help but shake his head. The difference between the truth and what was written was like two different worlds. Still, he didn't let anger take over. Instead, he decided to learn everything he could. Every law he read, every case he studied gave him more strength. He discovered the rules of police conduct, the procedures for lawful stops, and the meaning of probable cause. Each page he turned was another piece of armor. He even practiced speaking, standing in front of a mirror, explaining his case as if he were already in court. He worked on staying calm, making his points clearly, avoiding emotion when possible. He knew the officer wouldn't expect much from him. That thought alone gave him confidence. On the day before his hearing, Daniel sat quietly in his living room sipping coffee. His phone buzzed with messages of support from friends, but he didn't reply. He was focused, determined. Outside, the world went on. Cars passed, people walked dogs, children played in the park. But inside, Daniel was preparing for something much larger. He wasn't just defending himself. He was standing up for something that went beyond one night. One stop, one officer. As the clock ticked, he felt something shift inside him, a calm strength that came not from anger but from clarity. He closed his notebook, set his papers in order, and took a deep breath. Tomorrow would be the start of something he hadn't planned for, but maybe it was something he was meant to do. And though he didn't know it yet, The courtroom was where everything would change. For him, for the officer, and for everyone watching. The night before the first court hearing, Daniel barely slept. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the same thoughts over and over. It didn't matter how many times he told himself to rest, and his mind refused to slow down. Every sound outside made him open his eyes again. He wasn't afraid exactly, but he was uneasy. It wasn't just about the charges. It was the idea that his truth could be buried under someone else's words, that the report, with all its lies, could be believed over his own voice. He kept imagining the officer sitting on the stand, confident, polished, and sure of himself. Daniel didn't have a uniform or a badge. All he had was his memory, his notes, and that video on his phone. When morning came, he got up early and dressed carefully. He chose a simple gray shirt and black pants, neat but not flashy. He wanted to look respectful, not defensive. Before leaving, he stood in front of the mirror and whispered to himself, "Just tell the truth. Stay calm. Don't let him control the story." The courthouse was busy when he arrived. People shuffled through metal detectors, clutching folders and papers. Some looked nervous, some tired, some angry. Everyone had their own battle that day. Daniel found a bench near the back and sat down, holding his documents tight against his chest. After a while, he heard his name called. He took a slow breath and stood up. The courtroom wasn't large, just a modest space with rows of benches, a wooden divider, and a high desk where the judge would sit. The air smelled faintly of coffee and paper. When Daniel stepped forward, he saw the officer sitting near the prosecutor's table, wearing his crisp uniform and a calm, almost bored expression. For a second, Daniel felt small. The badge, the uniform, the authority, it was all designed to make people feel powerless. But then he remembered that night, the way he'd been treated, the cold cuffs on his wrists. That memory brought the fire back. The judge entered, and everyone stood. The sound of the gavel echoed sharp and commanding. The hearing began with formalities. The prosecutor read the charges aloud. The defendant is accused of resisting arrest and obstruction of justice. Daniel's heart pounded. But he stood tall. When it was his turn to speak, he said clearly, "Your Honor, I intend to represent myself." There was a brief pause. The judge looked at him over her glasses. "Are you certain about that?" she asked. "You have the right to legal counsel." "Yes, Your Honor," Daniel said. "I understand my rights." The judge nodded slowly, studying him. "Very well. You may proceed." The prosecutor presented the officer's report describing Daniel as uncooperative and verbally aggressive. Every word felt like a sting. Daniel listened quietly, taking notes, his pen moving quickly. He didn't interrupt. He just waited. When the officer took the stand, his tone was measured, almost practiced. He described the night as if he had followed every rule, saying Daniel had refused to hand over his ID, that he had stepped out of the vehicle in a hostile manner, and that the arrest was made to ensure safety. Daniel couldn't believe the confidence in his voice. It was as if the man had convinced himself it had really happened that way. The judge seemed to listen carefully but didn't show much expression. Then it was Daniel's turn. He stood, his notes trembling slightly in his hands. "Officer," he began, "can you confirm that you told me I had a broken taillight?" "Yes," the officer replied. "And you wrote in your report that I was verbally aggressive. Can you explain what I said that you found aggressive?" The officer hesitated. "Your tone was confrontational." Daniel nodded slowly. "Do you remember the exact words I used?" "I don't recall every word," the officer said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "That's okay," Daniel replied calmly. "Because I do." He took out his phone. "Your Honor, I have video footage from that night." The prosecutor objected immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. This evidence was not submitted in advance." Daniel responded, "I only recently obtained a copy from my device after retrieving it from the impound lot. I believe it directly relates to the truth of this case." The judge leaned forward, thoughtful. "We'll allow a short recess. Mr. Daniel, please ensure that the footage is provided for review." During the short break, Daniel sat outside the courtroom, his hands still shaking slightly. He couldn't tell if the judge believed him yet, but for the first time he felt like he had a chance. He looked out the window at the people walking by, each one living a life that would never cross paths with his, and he wondered how many others had been in this position, accused, disbelieved and forced to fight just to be heard. When the session resumed, Daniel played the video from his phone, connecting it to a screen in front of the judge. The courtroom fell silent as the footage began. The video showed Daniel sitting calmly in his car, hands visible, voice steady. Every word was polite. Every move was careful. The officer's tone, on the other hand, was sharp, impatient. The moment when Daniel was ordered out of the car, man without cause, played clearly. The arrest, the confusion, the silence afterward. When the video ended, nobody spoke for several seconds. The prosecutor cleared his throat. "Your Honor, while the video does show," the judge raised a hand. "I've seen enough for today. We'll reconvene next week after further review." As the gavel came down, Daniel exhaled for what felt like the first time all day. The officer didn't look at him as he left the courtroom. Outside, Daniel stood on the courthouse steps, the cool air washing over him. His heart was still beating fast, but there was something else now, a quiet strength. He knew the fight wasn't over, but he had made the first crack in the wall. That night, Daniel sat at his kitchen table again, surrounded by papers and printouts. He replayed the video again, not because he doubted it, but because it reminded him that truth had a way of cutting through lies. He made a list of questions for the next hearing. Short, direct, factual. He studied every line of the police report and matched each one against the footage. Every inconsistency became a small victory. In between the work, his phone buzzed with messages. His sister sent encouraging words, his co-workers asked how things were going, and a close friend offered to help gather more evidence. Daniel was grateful, but deep down, he knew this was something he had to do himself. Days passed, and the case began to draw quiet attention in the community. A local paper had mentioned it briefly. Man challenges officer's account in traffic stop dispute. It wasn't front-page news, but people were talking. Some said he was brave. Others thought he was crazy to go up against the system alone. Daniel didn't care what they said. For him, it wasn't about attention. It was about making sure that what happened to him wouldn't happen to someone else without a fight. He spent his nights studying legal documents online, reading real cases where ordinary people had defended themselves successfully. He learned about due process, about evidence procedure, about how to question a witness without losing composure. It wasn't easy. There were times when the words on the page blurred together, when exhaustion made him question if it was worth it. But every time he thought about giving up, he saw the image of that night, the lights, the cuffs, the feeling of helplessness, and then he kept going. He practiced his speech out loud, imagining himself standing before the judge again. "Your Honor, the facts speak for themselves. The evidence shows no resistance, no obstruction. The officer's report is inconsistent with both his own statements and the video proof." He repeated it until it sounded natural, confident, not rehearsed. On the morning of the second hearing, he arrived early again. The same courthouse, the same hallways, but something felt different. He wasn't nervous this time. He was ready. When the session began, the prosecutor looked less sure of himself. The judge addressed the courtroom with a steady voice. "Mr. Daniel, the court has reviewed your video evidence and found it admissible. We'll proceed accordingly." Daniel nodded respectfully. The officer was called to the stand again. This time, Daniel questioned him carefully. "You stated in your report that I refused to comply with commands. At what point in the video do I do that?" The officer shifted in his seat. "You hesitated to exit the vehicle. Hesitation isn't refusal, correct?" The officer didn't answer immediately. "It can be interpreted as interpretation isn't fact," Daniel interrupted gently. "Would you agree?" The judge looked up briefly, almost hiding a faint nod. Daniel continued, calm and methodical. Each question he asked made the inconsistencies clearer. He wasn't attacking the officer. He was exposing the truth step by step. By the time he finished, the courtroom was quiet. The prosecutor asked for a recess again, but the judge shook her head. "No need," she said. "We've seen enough for today." When the session ended, Daniel stepped outside once more. The sun was bright this time, warm against his face. He felt lighter, though he knew the case wasn't finished. There were still hearings to come, still legal steps to go through. But for the first time in a long while, he felt seen, not as a suspect, but as a man who refused to be silent. That evening, as he walked home, a neighbor stopped him on the sidewalk. "I read about your case," the man said softly. "Good for you. Keep standing up. Daniel smiled, a little surprised. Thank you, he said. Not everyone has the courage to do what you're doing, the neighbor added. Daniel stood still, unsure whether to smile or cry. He just nodded respectfully to the judge. Thank you, Your Honor. As he walked out of the courtroom, people clapped softly. He didn't expect it, but it filled his heart. Outside, he took a long breath of fresh air and looked up at the sky. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't scared. He was free. But deep inside, he knew the story wasn't over. His name was cleared, but there were others who would face the same thing tomorrow, next week, next year. He couldn't help but think. Maybe he could use what he learned to help them too. That night, back at home, he sat in front of his laptop, writing everything down, not just for himself, but for anyone who might need it. He wrote about how to stay calm, how to collect evidence, how to speak clearly in court, how to believe in truth even when nobody else does. He didn't write like a teacher or a lawyer. He wrote like a man who had walked through the fire and made it outstanding. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair, tired but peaceful. The clock on the wall ticked softly. Outside, the city was quiet. For the first time in months, Daniel smiled to himself. Not because he had won, but because he had proven that honesty, patience, and courage could still mean something in the world. He turned off the light and whispered, almost to himself, the truth really does set you free. And with that thought, he finally slept soundly, knowing that the hardest part was behind him, and something bigger was waiting ahead. After the court case ended and the judge dismissed all the charges, Daniel thought things would go back to normal right away. He imagined waking up the next morning feeling free, lighter, ready to move on with his life. But it didn't happen like that. The first few days after the verdict were strange. He went back to work, tried to pick up where he had left off, but something in him had changed. Every time he walked down the street and saw a police car, his heart still jumped a little. Even though he had done nothing wrong, that old fear stayed with him, hiding behind his calm face. At work, people treated him differently. Some co-workers looked at him with admiration, while others avoided the topic completely. During lunch breaks, a few of them asked how it felt to win in court. Daniel would smile politely and say, it wasn't about winning. It was about doing what's right. He meant it. Still, there were quiet moments when he sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen, and wondered if he really was free. Because yes, the charges were gone, but the memory wasn't. One evening, his phone buzzed with a message from a reporter who had covered his case. She asked if he would be willing to appear in a community panel about fairness in the justice system. At first, Daniel hesitated. He wasn't sure he wanted to keep reliving the story. But something in him said it might help others. He typed back, sure, I'll do it. A week later, he found himself sitting on a small stage at the local community center. The room was full, students, parents, teachers, and even a few off-duty police officers in plain clothes. The moderator began with introductions, then asked Daniel to share his experience. He took a deep breath before speaking. I used to think that if you were honest and respectful, nothing bad could happen to you, he said. But life taught me that sometimes the truth needs help being heard. I didn't fight back with anger. I fought with patience and facts. That's what made the difference. The room was quiet as he spoke. People leaned in, listening closely. After the event, several people came up to thank him. One young man said, I went through something similar. I gave up because I didn't think anyone would believe me. Hearing your story makes me want to try again. That moment touched Daniel more than anything else had. It made him realize that what happened to him could become something more, a reason to help others. Over the next few months, Daniel started volunteering with a local group that offered advice to people who had been unfairly treated or falsely accused. He didn't act like a lawyer, he wasn't one, but he listened, guided, and helped people understand their rights. He showed them how to stay calm, how to document everything, how to speak with confidence. He spent evenings sitting in small rooms with strangers who reminded him of himself, tired, worried, and unsure what to do next. He told them, the truth is powerful, but only if you stay patient enough to let it work. Each time he said those words, he believed them a little more. The officer who had accused him was still under investigation. Daniel didn't follow the details closely, but one afternoon, He received a short letter from the court stating that the officer had been placed on suspension for misconduct. He read the letter slowly, then folded it and set it aside. He didn't feel happiness or revenge, just closure. He whispered to himself, "It's done." That night, he went for a long walk around his neighborhood. The air was warm and calm. He passed the same streets where he used to feel uneasy. But now, for the first time in months, he didn't flinch when a patrol car drove by. He simply nodded to himself and kept walking. In the following weeks, Daniel's life began to settle again. He spent more time with his family, helped his mother with errands, visited old friends he hadn't seen in a while. When they asked about the case, he always said the same thing. "It's behind me, but it taught me a lot about people." Still, a small part of him couldn't let go completely. Late at night, he sometimes replayed that courtroom moment in his mind. The part when the judge said, "The charges are dismissed." Those words echoed softly, reminding him how far he'd come. One afternoon, while working at his desk, he got an email from a university law student who had read about his case. The message said, "I'm studying criminal law and your story inspired my thesis about fairness in the justice system. Thank you for showing that knowledge can protect us." Daniel smiled as he read it. It amazed him how his story had reached so many people he'd never met, from places he'd never been. A few weeks later, he was invited to give a talk at a local high school. He didn't prepare a fancy speech. He just told the truth the same way he had in court. He told the students, "Don't be afraid to learn about your rights. You don't need to be a lawyer to understand what's fair. You just need to care enough to ask questions." Afterward, a teacher thanked him for coming. "You made them listen," she said. Sometimes real stories teach better than any textbook. Walking home that day, Daniel thought about how different his life had become. A year ago, he was just a quiet man trying to get home from work. Now he was someone people looked to for advice, someone who had turned pain into purpose. But there were still days when the memory returned. The flashing lights, the fear, the feeling of being helpless. It didn't disappear completely. Instead, it became part of his story, like a scar that no longer hurt but never quite faded. He learned to accept it. One evening, he sat on his balcony watching the sunset. The colors stretched across the sky, soft and calm. His phone buzzed with a new message from someone he didn't know. It was short. "I saw your story online. My brother went through something similar, and your courage gave us hope. Thank you." Daniel read it twice. He didn't reply right away. He just sat there letting the words sink in. He realized that sometimes the most powerful change comes quietly. One story, one person at a time. A few months later, a community group invited him to help create a workshop about knowing your rights during police stops. They wanted him to share his experience and help design educational materials for young people. Daniel agreed without hesitation. The workshops became popular. People came from nearby towns to listen and learn. They asked questions, shared their own fears, and took notes as Daniel spoke. He didn't try to sound like an expert. He spoke like someone who had been there, someone who had felt the confusion, the anger, and the relief of finally being heard. One night, after finishing a session, a woman approached him. She was older, maybe in her 60s, with kind eyes and a calm voice. She said, "You remind me of my son. He used to say, 'One person can't change the system. But watching you, I think maybe one person can start something.'" Daniel smiled softly. "Maybe not change everything," he said, "but we can change the way people think. That's where it begins." When he got home that night, he opened his old notebook, the same one filled with notes from the case. The pages were worn, edges curled, ink fading in some spots. He flipped through them slowly. Every page told part of his journey. The research, the doubts, the questions, the evidence. He realized he didn't need it anymore, but he couldn't bring himself to throw it away. It wasn't just paper. It was proof of who he had become. He closed it gently and placed it on a shelf. Over time, Daniel found peace in simple things again. Morning walks, quiet dinners with friends, long talks with his family. But every once in a while, someone would recognize him and stop to say thank you. It always surprised him, and it always humbled him. One weekend, he attended a small local fair with his sister. They walked past food stalls and music stands, laughing and enjoying the day. Then out of nowhere, a young man approached him. "Excuse me," the man said. "Are you the guy who represented himself in court?" Daniel smiled. Yeah, that was me. The man nodded, his eyes full of respect. I just wanted to say your story helped me. I was scared to speak up about something that happened to me, but after watching your interview, I decided not to stay silent. Thank you. Daniel shook his hand. I'm glad you did. The truth deserves to be heard. As they walked away, his sister nudged him playfully. You're kind of a local hero now, she teased. He laughed. I don't know about hero, he said. Just someone who got tired of being quiet. That night, as he sat by his window, he thought about those words. Maybe that's what courage really was, not loud or bold, just quiet persistence. The strength to keep standing even when the world tries to push you down. He looked out at the city lights blinking in the distance and whispered to himself, maybe this was always meant to happen, not to break me, but to wake me up. And as he sat there with the cool night air drifting in, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace, steady and deep. He didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time he wasn't afraid of it. Months passed, and life slowly began to settle into a peaceful rhythm for Daniel. The noise around his case had quieted down, but the echoes of it still reached him now and then. Sometimes, when he walked into a cafe or down a familiar street, people would recognize him. They'd smile or nod politely as if to say, we remember, but Daniel didn't want fame. What he wanted was meaning, a reason for everything that had happened. And in small ways, he found it. The community workshops continued to grow. What had started as a simple talk in a classroom turned into a movement that brought people together. Every month, new faces appeared, students, parents, teachers, and even police officers who wanted to learn, to listen, and to understand. At first, Daniel had been nervous about speaking to officers. He worried they might be defensive or try to argue. But what surprised him was how many came simply to hear his side. One evening, during a session, a young officer approached him afterward and said quietly, I saw what happened in your case. I just want to say not all of us agree with what that officer did. Some of us want to do better. Daniel nodded. That's all I ever wanted. For people to want to do better. That small exchange stayed with him for a long time. It reminded him that change didn't always come from protests or arguments. Sometimes it started with honest conversations. As the weeks went by, Daniel began to feel a deep sense of purpose in his work. He spent his evenings helping others understand how to handle legal situations, how to stay calm, how to speak clearly when the world wanted them to stay quiet. He didn't see himself as a hero or leader, just a guide who had walked a rough road and made it through. But deep down, he still thought about what had happened that night, the flashing lights, the cold handcuffs, the feeling of being treated as something less than human. Those memories didn't fade completely. Instead, they shaped him, gave him a quiet strength he carried everywhere he went. One afternoon, Daniel received a letter from the state attorney's office. It wasn't about him this time. It was a notice that the officer involved in his case had been officially dismissed from the force. The letter was short and formal, filled with legal phrases and signatures. But the meaning was clear. Daniel read it once, then again. For a moment, he just sat there staring at the paper. He didn't feel joy or anger, just closure. He folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and whispered softly, It's finally over. That evening, he decided to visit his old neighborhood, the place where everything had started. The streets were quieter than he remembered, but familiar. As he walked, people waved and smiled. Some stopped him to talk. An older man from down the street clapped him on the shoulder and said, You gave us all something to be proud of, son. Daniel smiled. I just wanted to be heard, he said. And you were, the man replied, loud and clear. Later, he stopped at the small park near his old apartment. He sat on a bench listening to the sounds of kids playing and birds calling from the trees. The sky above was soft and golden, fading into shades of orange and pink. It was the kind of evening that made everything feel still. He thought about how far he'd come. The fear, the frustration, the courtroom tension, all of it had led him here to this quiet peace. And though he had no way of knowing what the future would bring, he finally felt ready for it. As the sun dipped lower, his phone buzzed. It was a message from the community center. They were planning a new event, a youth mentorship program focused on leadership, fairness, and responsibility. They wanted Daniel to lead it. He smiled, shaking his head slightly. Life had a funny way of circling back. He texted back, "Count me in." Weeks later, the program began. The first session was small, just a handful of teenagers sitting in folding chairs, half curious, half distracted. Daniel stood at the front of the room looking at them. He remembered being their age, thinking the world was simple, black and white, fair or unfair. He wished someone back then had told him that life wasn't about waiting for fairness, but about learning how to stand up for it. He began speaking in a calm voice. "When I was your age, I thought being right was enough. But life taught me that sometimes, even when you're right, you have to fight to prove it, not with anger, with patience, with truth." At first, the room was quiet. Then one of the students raised a hand and asked, "Weren't you scared?" Daniel smiled softly. "Yes, I was scared. But courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to stand even when fear is sitting right next to you." The students listened. Some nodded. Some looked down, thinking. By the end of the session, a few came up to him to thank him. One girl said, "I want to be a lawyer someday. I want to help people like you did." That night, Daniel went home feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Months turned into a year, and the mentorship program grew. Local schools invited Daniel to speak. Newspapers wrote short features about his work. But even with the attention, he stayed humble. Whenever people tried to call him a hero, he would just smile and say, "I just told the truth." He never forgot what it felt like to be powerless. And that memory became his reason to make sure others didn't feel the same. One evening, after a long day of meetings and mentoring, Daniel received an invitation from a nearby university. They wanted him to speak at a seminar about justice and equality. It would be his biggest audience yet: students, professors, even community leaders. He accepted, though the thought made him nervous. He wasn't used to big crowds or fancy settings. But when the day came and he stood at the podium looking out at the hundreds of faces, something inside him settled. He spoke slowly, clearly, from the heart. He told them his story, not to gain sympathy but to show what knowledge and calm persistence could do. "I used to think the system was unbreakable," he said, "but I learned that truth has a quiet power. When you stay calm, when you know your rights, when you don't give up, that's when real change begins." When he finished, the room erupted into applause. Some people even stood. But Daniel didn't feel pride. He felt gratitude. Gratitude that his pain had turned into purpose. After the event, a professor approached him and said, "Have you ever thought about studying law formally? You have the mind and heart for it." Daniel laughed softly. "Maybe someday," he said, but that thought stayed with him. Over the next few months, he began taking night classes in legal studies. Not because he wanted a new career, but because he wanted to understand more, to keep growing, to keep helping others. He studied late into the nights, his small apartment lit by a single lamp. Sometimes he would pause, thinking back to the night he was first accused and how helpless he had felt, and how far he had come since then. One evening, he looked up from his books, smiled to himself, and whispered, "You made it through." As the seasons changed, so did Daniel. He wasn't just the man who once stood in court defending himself. He was now a mentor, a teacher, a quiet force in his community. The fear that had once lived in his chest was gone. In its place was calm confidence, the kind that comes from surviving something hard and coming out stronger on the other side. One afternoon, he was walking through town when he saw a young man being stopped by two officers. The young man looked nervous, his hands trembling slightly. Daniel slowed his steps, watching from a distance. But the officers were polite, calm, following the right procedures. When they finished and left, the young man noticed Daniel watching. He smiled awkwardly and said, "Guess I got lucky." Daniel shook his head gently. "No, son. That's how it's supposed to be." They exchanged a brief nod before going their separate ways. As Daniel walked away, he felt a deep sense of peace. Maybe things were slowly changing after all, and not everywhere. Not all at once, but in small, meaningful steps. That evening, he returned home and sat by his window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The world outside still had its flaws, still had its injustices, but he no longer felt powerless against them. He had found his voice. And through that, he had helped others find theirs. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and smiled softly. The world wasn't perfect, but he had learned something important. Sometimes one person's courage to stand up, even quietly, can spark the courage in others to do the same. And that, he thought, was how change truly begins, not in courtrooms or headlines, but in the quiet strength of ordinary people refusing to give up.